July, 1944. A Wisconsin mess hall, cold fluorescent lights humming overhead. 60 Japanese women kneel before metal trays, hands trembling. On each plate, 2 strips of bacon, scrambled eggs, toast still warm. The smell, rich, fatty, impossible, makes them dizzy. This is the trap, Keiko thinks. They'll watch us reach for it, then pull it away. Or worse, it's poisoned. They'd been raised on posters screaming that Americans were demons who tortured prisoners, who showed no mercy. Yet here sat breakfast, more food than she'd seen in 2 years. Across from her, Sachiko whispers the Emperor's name like a prayer, tears already starting. A female guard, Corporal Henderson, takes a bite of bacon from her own tray. Doesn't die. Says in broken Japanese, "Geneva Convention, you eat." But Geneva Convention was supposed to be a lie. American propaganda. So why does the bacon smell so real? And why are the monsters offering them forks? If everything they'd been taught was wrong, what else was a lie? But before we dive in, if you want more incredible untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, smash that subscribe button. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far the truth travels. July, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Keiko Tanaka knelt on the wooden floor of the mess hall, her knees pressed against planks that still smelled of pine and disinfectant. Before her sat a metal tray, standard issue, scratched from 1,000 previous meals. On it rested 2 strips of bacon, their edges crisp and dark, fat still glistening. Scrambled eggs, pale yellow and steaming. 2 pieces of toast with a small paper cup of butter. A tin cup of coffee, black, sending up wisps of vapor in the cool morning air. The smell hit her like a physical force, rich, fatty, impossible. Salt and smoke and something she couldn't name because she hadn't tasted it in so long. Her body had forgotten what abundance smelled like. Her hands trembled. She pressed them flat against her thighs, feeling the rough cotton of the prisoner uniform they'd been issued the night before. Gray, clean, 2 sizes too large. Around her, 59 other Japanese women knelt in identical positions, identical uniforms, identical terror. No one spoke. No one reached for the food. The silence stretched so tight it hummed. This was the torture then. They would let them smell it, let them see it, let hunger claw at their bellies until they reached for it, and then it would be snatched away, or worse. Keiko had heard stories from other prisoners during the chaos of capture on Saipan, whispered rumors that came third and fourth hand. Americans poisoned prisoners' food, tested chemicals, made them sick just to watch them suffer. She'd dismissed the stories then as hysteria. But now, staring at bacon that seemed too perfect, too generous, doubt crept in like cold water. Beside her, Sachiko Mori made a small sound in the back of her throat. Not quite a whimper, more like a prayer being strangled. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. The Emperor's name, probably, or a blessing for the dead. Sachiko had been a nurse on Saipan, had seen things that left her eyes hollow, even when she smiled. Now those eyes were fixed on the eggs, and tears were already tracking down her thin face, cutting lines through the dust that 3 days of transport had ground into her skin. At the front of the mess hall, Corporal Ruth Henderson stood with her shoulders squared and her face carefully blank. She was tall for a woman, angular, with dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her uniform was immaculate, every button aligned, every crease sharp enough to cut. She held her own tray, identical to theirs. Without ceremony, without speaking, she picked up her fork. She speared a piece of bacon, brought it to her mouth, chewed, swallowed, did not die, did not collapse, did not even flinch. Then she spoke, her Japanese halting and textbook formal, each word carefully pronounced like she was reading from a card. Geneva Convention. You eat. You eat every day. Keiko felt something crack in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but a hairline fracture in the certainty that had carried her through capture, through the hold of the transport ship, through processing at the main gate. The Geneva Convention was propaganda. Everyone knew that. A fairy tale that Americans told themselves to feel civilized while they committed atrocities. It couldn't be real. Real things didn't include bacon for prisoners. Real things didn't include enemy soldiers demonstrating that food wasn't poisoned by eating it first. But the bacon was still there, still steaming, still smelling like every memory of peacetime Tokyo, of her father's print shop near the market where vendors sold grilled meat on festival days, of the life before war, when food was food and not a weapon. Henderson set down her fork and stepped back, her face still neutral. But Keiko, who had spent 6 years teaching children to read micro-expressions and spot lies, saw the tension in the woman's jaw, saw the way her hand drifted toward the pocket of her uniform where something rectangular made a small bulge. A book, maybe, or papers. Something she touched for reassurance. The women didn't move. 60 statues. 60 held breaths. Keiko's stomach cramped so hard she nearly gasped. When had she last eaten? Really eaten? The ship had provided thin rice gruel, barely enough to keep them conscious. Before that, the holding camp on Saipan had been 3 weeks of near starvation. The Japanese supply lines already collapsed. Civilian rations cut to almost nothing. Before that, the months leading up to the American landing when food shipments stopped arriving, and everyone pretended not to notice how their clothes hung looser, how children's faces grew sharp and hollow. 2 years. She hadn't tasted bacon in 2 years. Hadn't tasted anything with fat and salt and richness in so long that her mouth flooded with saliva just looking at it. She was going to break. She knew it. Felt it happening like ice cracking on a spring river. If this was torture, if they snatched it away or she died from poison, at least she would die with the taste of bacon on her tongue, instead of the taste of shame and seawater. Keiko picked up the fork. Her hand shook so badly the metal rattled against the tray. She cut the smallest possible piece of bacon, a fragment no larger than her thumbnail, brought it to her mouth, closed her lips around it. Salt, smoke, fat that melted on her tongue and flooded every nerve ending with sensation so intense it was almost pain. She couldn't stop the sound that escaped her, half sob, half sigh. The bacon tasted real, tasted like food, not chemicals, tasted like something made to nourish, not to kill. Around her, a dam broke. Sachiko grabbed her toast with both hands, tearing into it like an animal. Other women reached for their trays with shaking fingers, some crying openly now, some eating in silence with tears streaming down their faces. The sound of forks on metal filled the hall. The sound of chewing. The sound of 60 women realizing they weren't going to die this morning after all. Keiko ate slowly, methodically, making each bite last. The eggs were real. The toast was real. The coffee was bitter and scalding and the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. She ate everything on her tray, scraping up the last bits of egg with her last corner of toast, and when it was gone, she felt simultaneously full and empty. Full of food, empty of certainty. Because if the bacon was real, what else might be real? And if the Americans meant to follow the Geneva Convention, if they meant to feed prisoners and keep them healthy and treat them like human beings instead of demons, then everything she'd been taught was wrong. Everything her brother had believed when he'd chosen death over the shame of American captivity was wrong. Everything that made his suicide make sense was wrong. That night, Keiko and Sachiko shared a bunk in a barracks that was heated, even though it was July and already warm. Heated, as if cold might come and the Americans planned to keep them comfortable. The absurdity of it made Keiko want to laugh or scream or both. On the wall hung a printed schedule, Red Cross inspection dates, library hours, medical clinic times, mail call procedures, everything organized, everything documented, everything designed to prove they were being treated according to rules that Keiko had been taught were lies. They whispered in the dark, their voices barely audible beneath the sounds of other women sleeping or crying or praying. Sachiko talked about the bacon, about how it had tasted like her grandmother's kitchen, about how she'd forgotten food could taste like anything except survival. Keiko didn't tell her about the letter that had arrived during processing, forwarded through Red Cross channels, a miracle of international mail that shouldn't have been possible if Americans were the monsters they'd been taught to fear. Her father's handwriting, shaky and formal. 3 sentences that had killed something in her chest. Your brother has passed. He returned from American captivity. He could not bear the shame. The bacon breakfast hadn't just tasted good. It had tasted like evidence. Evidence that her brother had died for a lie. Evidence that whatever the Americans had done to him in their prison camp, it hadn't been the torture he'd been promised. It had been something else. Something that let him survive physically, but killed him anyway when he came home and faced a Japan that couldn't forgive survival. The bacon tasted like betrayal, like a truth that was more dangerous than any lie. And Keiko, lying in a heated barracks in Wisconsin with her stomach full for the first time in years, faced a question more terrifying than any interrogation. If the Americans weren't monsters, what had her brother died for? 3 weeks passed like a fever dream. Keiko watched herself gain weight, watched her hands stop shaking, watched the other women's faces fill out as hollows disappeared, and cheekbones softened under layers of flesh that shouldn't exist on prisoners of war. Every morning, breakfast arrived. Every afternoon, lunch. Every evening, dinner. Meat, vegetables, bread, milk. More calories than she'd consumed in peacetime Tokyo, when her father's print shop had been prosperous, and rationing was just a rumor on the horizon. She started documenting everything in a journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress, writing in the smallest characters possible to conserve the precious paper Henderson had provided when Keiko asked, not begged, for something to write on. The calories they received, approximately 2,800 per day, according to her careful tracking. The medical care, Sachiko had been diagnosed with tuberculosis she'd hidden for months, terrified that weakness would mean elimination, and now received treatment that included rest periods, extra rations, and medicine that came in small white tablets she took twice daily. The wages they earned for voluntary work in the camp laundry and kitchen, 10 cents a day in script they could spend at the canteen on soap, writing paper, chocolate bars that seemed like objects from another universe. Keiko became the informal leader by accident and necessity. Her English, learned in Tokyo Girls' School before the war, made foreign languages suspect, was functional enough for basic translation. The other women looked to her during inspections, during medical examinations, during the daily routines that still felt like elaborate theater, designed to trick them into lowering their guard before the real punishment began. She translated their fears and needs to Henderson and the other staff. She explained rules and schedules and the incomprehensible American obsession with documentation. She became a bridge built on shaking foundations, and the weight of it pressed on her shoulders like stones. But beneath the surface of adjustment, darker currents flowed. 7 women refused to eat, convinced it was all preparation for something worse. They accepted only enough to stay conscious, treating each meal like a test of loyalty to the emperor, to Japan, to the propaganda that had shaped their entire understanding of the world. One woman, Mrs. Yamada, a shopkeeper's wife from Hiroshima who'd been visiting her sister on Saipan when the island fell, attempted to hang herself in the latrine using strips torn from her uniform. Henderson found her, cut her down, saved her life with brutal efficiency that came from nurses' training and probably too much practice. Mrs. Yamada regained consciousness and spat in Henderson's face, the gesture so loaded with contempt and shame that even Henderson flinched. The ultimate act of loyalty, ruined by enemy mercy. The camp administrators asked Keiko to speak with Mrs. Yamada to explain that suicide attempts would result in isolation for safety, not punishment. Keiko sat on the edge of the woman's infirmary cot and heard herself saying words that felt like glass in her mouth. Stay alive. Accept the food. Trust the Geneva Convention. And Mrs. Yamada stared at her, with eyes that held nothing but accusation, and whispered that Keiko had become a collaborator, that gaining weight on enemy food was its own form of betrayal, that when they returned to Japan, if they returned, there would be consequences for women who'd grown comfortable in captivity. Keiko thought about her brother every night, thought about whether he'd received bacon for breakfast in the American camp that kept him alive, thought about whether he'd gained weight and learned English, and started to doubt the propaganda that had sent him to war. Thought about what it must have felt like to survive capture, to be released in a prisoner exchange, to return home and face neighbors who saw healthy flesh on his bones and wondered what he'd done to earn it. 3 days. He'd lasted 3 days before shame killed him more efficiently than any bullet. The bacon had tasted like survival. But survival, Keiko was learning, was complicated when your entire culture had prepared you to die rather than endure it. Henderson volunteered to help teach an English class. It was optional, purely voluntary, but 24 women attended, including Keiko, who wanted to improve her grammar and vocabulary. They sat at tables in the camp education room, surrounded by children's primers decorated with pictures of apples and cats and houses, learning phrases that felt absurd in their practicality. Good morning. Please. Thank you. How are you? Words for a world where enemies spoke politely to each other, where communication mattered more than silence. Henderson stood at the front of the room, her posture military straight, her voice steady as she led them through pronunciation, drills. But during a break when the other women were practicing with each other, Keiko approached her with a question that had been burning in her chest for weeks. She asked in her careful English, each word chosen deliberately, "Why? Why you good to us? Why you follow rules when we are enemies? Why you save women who spit at you? Why any of this when propaganda says Americans are demons who torture prisoners?" Henderson looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, more like a wall developing a crack. She reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out the rectangular object Keiko had noticed before, a small handbook worn at the edges from constant handling. The Geneva Convention regulations, printed in English, annotated with handwritten notes in the margins. Henderson's answer came slowly, in English that Keiko had to strain to follow but understood in her bones. Because the rules say I have to be, and I need the rules to be true. Because if they torture you in Japan, and we torture you here, then my husband died for nothing. He died at Pearl Harbor in the first hour of the war. He was an engineer. He never fired a shot. He died because Japan attacked. And I need to believe he died defending something real. Defending a country that actually honors what it claims to believe. Not just words on paper. Real honor, real rules, real treatment even for enemies. Especially for enemies. Because if we become monsters to fight monsters, then what's the point? Then everyone just dies in the dark. Keiko felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. Henderson looked away, giving her privacy, but her jaw was tight again, and her hand gripped the Geneva Convention handbook like a lifeline. The women weren't the only ones lied to. The Americans had been fed propaganda too, told that Japanese were subhuman, that they didn't value life, that they were fanatics incapable of reason or mercy. Henderson had believed it, had enlisted believing it, had come to Camp McCoy ready to hate them. But then she'd opened the handbook and decided that following the rules mattered more than following her rage, that honoring her husband's death meant being better than the hate. 2 weeks later, a film crew arrived. Red Cross officials, American military photographers, men with clipboards and cameras who wanted to document Geneva Convention compliance for international review. Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard, the camp commander, whose meticulous record-keeping had become legendary among the prisoners, explained that participation was voluntary. No one would be punished for refusing, but women who were willing to speak on camera about their treatment would be helping establish proof that America followed international law, that their testimony might protect American prisoners in Japanese camps through the pressure of reciprocal accountability. Keiko volunteered. So did 15 other women. They sat in the mess hall under bright lights that made everything feel surreal and theatrical, and answered questions in Japanese that would be translated and transcribed. Keiko described the bacon breakfast, described the warm barracks and the medical care and the wages they earned, described Henderson eating first to prove the food wasn't poisoned. And then, with cameras rolling and her heart hammering, she said in clear Japanese that would be preserved on film for posterity. "I was taught Americans were demons. I was wrong." The words hung in the air like smoke. She felt like a traitor saying them, felt like she was betraying her brother, her father, every teacher who'd taught her that the emperor was divine and enemies were subhuman. But she also felt, for the first time since capture, like she was telling the truth, the whole truth. Not the truth propaganda demanded, but the truth her own eyes and stomach and healing body had shown her. Americans weren't demons. They were people who followed rules, who carried Geneva Convention handbooks, who saved prisoners who spat at them because nurses save lives, even when hearts want revenge, who fed enemies bacon because the law said prisoners deserved food, and the law mattered more than hate. That night, Keiko lay awake wondering what would happen when this film reached Japan, wondering if her father would see it, wondering if Mrs. Yamada was right, if there would be consequences for women who admitted receiving decent treatment, who gained weight and learned English and stopped believing the propaganda that had sent millions to their deaths. The bacon breakfast had stopped being about bacon weeks ago. Now it was evidence. Evidence of a lie so big it had devoured her brother. Evidence that might get her killed when she went home. Evidence that might also save someone else's brother in the next war, if anyone bothered to remember. If anyone chose truth over comfort. She touched the hidden journal under her mattress and thought about witness, about testimony, about the terrifying responsibility of surviving when survival itself was proof that everything you'd been taught was wrong. Mail service improved as summer turned toward autumn. Letters began arriving with increasing regularity, forwarded through Red Cross channels that somehow navigated the chaos of war to connect prisoners with families half a world away. Keiko wrote carefully worded letters home, aware that censors on both sides would read every character. She couldn't tell the full truth, couldn't write that she ate bacon for breakfast, or that American guards treated tuberculosis, or that she was gaining weight while Japan starved. But she hinted, used phrases like treated, according to international law, and in good health and receiving adequate rations. Phrases that said nothing and everything, that any careful reader might decode as evidence of something unexpected. 3 weeks after she mailed her first letter, a response arrived. Her father's handwriting, still shaky, still formal. The envelope had been opened and resealed multiple times, examined by censors in San Francisco and Tokyo, and probably a dozen points between. The letter inside was brief. He acknowledged receipt of her correspondence, confirmed that he remained in Tokyo despite the bombings, made no mention of her brother, and then, in the final line, a sentence that made Keiko's hands go cold. "When you return, we will speak of your experiences privately, not proudly, not publicly." The implication settled in her stomach like lead. Her survival was not something to celebrate. It was something to hide, something to be discussed behind closed doors where neighbors couldn't hear and authorities couldn't judge. She read the letter 3 times, looking for warmth she knew wouldn't appear, then folded it carefully and placed it in her hidden journal where it sat like evidence of a future she was beginning to dread. Other women received responses too. Sachiko got a letter from her mother in Osaka, full of mundane details about rationing and air raid drills and the neighbor's son who'd been killed in Burma. Normal things, safe things. But at the end, a postscript that Sachiko showed Keiko with trembling hands. Do not speak of good treatment if it was given. When you return, there will be questions. Better to have no answers than wrong ones. The message was clear. The truth was dangerous. More dangerous than lies. More dangerous than silence. Survivors of American camps would face interrogation, suspicion, accusations of collaboration. The bacon breakfast that had seemed like mercy in July felt like poison in September. Not because it had harmed their bodies, but because it had created proof, living, breathing, flesh and bone proof, that contradicted every narrative Japan had built to justify the war. They were evidence of American humanity, and that evidence made them traitors. Henderson noticed the change in the women's demeanor after the letters arrived. The way conversations grew quieter. The way some women stopped attending English classes. The way Keiko's translations became more mechanical, less engaged, as if she was rebuilding walls that had temporarily come down. During a routine medical check where Henderson was monitoring Sachiko's tuberculosis recovery, she asked what had changed, asked why the atmosphere in the barracks felt heavier, despite the women being healthier than they'd been in months. Sachiko, whose English had improved dramatically with treatment and rest, answered with a candor that surprised even Keiko. She explained about the letters, about the warnings coded in careful language, about how their families were telling them that survival carried consequences. That good treatment was suspicious. That when the war ended and they returned home, the weight they'd gained and the health they'd recovered would be seen as evidence of spiritual surrender, of collaboration, of choosing life over loyalty. Henderson listened without interrupting, her face going through subtle shifts that Keiko had learned to read. Shock, comprehension, something that looked like grief. When Sachiko finished, Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then, she told them about her work before Camp McCoy, about enlisting specifically for POW operations, about carrying hate like a second uniform until the Geneva Convention handbook became more important than rage, about how following the rules when her heart wanted revenge was the hardest thing she'd ever done, and about the realization that had kept her going, that if America tortured Japanese prisoners, then Japanese commanders would use it as justification to torture American prisoners. That mercy was strategic, that the rules protected everyone or they protected no one. But there was something else in Henderson's voice now, a new understanding. She said in her careful Japanese mixed with English that the three of them had developed as a hybrid communication, that she was beginning to see the bigger trap, that America was following the Geneva Convention to prove it was civilized, to demonstrate moral superiority, to create evidence for history. But that evidence was turning into a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. That Japanese prisoners who received decent treatment became proof of America's righteousness and Japan's barbarism, which meant Japan couldn't acknowledge that treatment without admitting propaganda was lies, which meant prisoners who testified to decent treatment became threats to national narrative, which meant the bacon breakfast that was supposed to save lives might end up destroying them in a different way. The three women sat in the infirmary, surrounded by medical supplies and tuberculosis treatment logs, and the mundane infrastructure of institutional care, and faced a truth more complex than any propaganda could capture. Mercy was real, but mercy had consequences. The rules worked, but the rules existed inside political systems that could turn evidence of humanity into ammunition for ideology. Henderson had saved Sachiko's life with medicine and bacon and Geneva Convention compliance. And that salvation might be what got Sachiko killed when she returned to an Osaka that couldn't forgive survival without suffering. Keiko made a decision in that moment, a reckless decision that felt like the only honest thing left. She asked Henderson for something impossible: documentation, medical records proving the treatment they'd received, copies of the film testimony, written statements from camp administration, physical proof that could survive the war. Not for her family, though that's what she said. For history. For the next generation. For anyone who needed to know that propaganda was a lie on both sides, that Americans had fed enemies bacon, not from weakness, but from principle, that Geneva Convention compliance was possible even in total war, that her brother might have lived if the truth had been available, before shame killed him. Henderson stared at her like she'd suggested treason, which technically Keiko had. Providing prisoners with documentation was against regulations. It could compromise security, could aid enemy intelligence, could end Henderson's career if discovered. The handbook she carried said prisoners were entitled to treatment, not evidence. To survival, not testimony. To life, not leverage. But Henderson also understood what Keiko wasn't saying, that this wasn't about individual survival anymore. This was about creating a record that might prevent the next war's propaganda from being quite so effective. That might give someone else's brother a reason to choose life over loyalty. That might prove, decades later, that rules could work if people chose to follow them, even when hearts screamed for revenge. 3 days later, Henderson slipped Keiko a Red Cross care package during routine distribution. Inside, beneath regulation items like soap and writing paper and a chocolate bar, were folded papers. Medical records documenting Sachiko's tuberculosis treatment and recovery. Caloric intake logs showing daily rations. A written statement from Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard confirming Geneva Convention compliance. Copies of inspection reports filed with International Red Cross. And a single photograph, 60 Japanese women in a Wisconsin mess hall, summer 1944. Keiko in the front row holding a fork. Henderson barely visible in the background, with an expression that was equal parts duty and doubt. Keiko hid the documents in her journal's false bottom, a trick her father had taught her for hiding print shop records from imperial censors, who sometimes decided civilian businesses were insufficiently patriotic. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd learned to hide truth from Japanese authorities. Now she was hiding truth about Japanese prisoners from those same authorities. The bacon breakfast had become sedition. Evidence had become contraband. Survival had become testimony. And testimony, Keiko was learning, was the most dangerous weapon of all. That night, she and Sachiko and 3 other women who'd received similar warnings in letters from home gathered in the barracks after lights out. They whispered in the dark about what would happen when the war ended, about repatriation, about facing families who'd been taught that prisoners who survived had dishonored themselves, about carrying proof of mercy back to a nation that needed enemies to be monsters. Someone asked if they should destroy the documents, burn the evidence, return home with nothing but vague stories that could be shaped to fit whatever narrative Japan demanded. Keiko thought about her brother, about the 3 days between his return and his death, about how maybe if he'd had proof that American camps followed rules, that survival wasn't shame, that the propaganda was lies on both sides, he might have chosen differently, might have lived. The documents felt like a gravestone, like a promise, like the only thing standing between truth and the next generation of bacon breakfasts that would be eaten in silence and hidden in shame. She told the women she was keeping the records. That history needed witnesses. That someone had to carry the truth forward even if it was dangerous, even if it was lonely, even if home meant facing accusations instead of welcome. The women were quiet for a long time. Then, one by one, they asked Henderson for their own documentation, their own proof, their own evidence that mercy had been real and rules had worked and propaganda had lied. They became archivists of their own survival, librarians of an inconvenient truth, keepers of the bacon breakfast's most dangerous secret, that it had actually happened. August 15th, 1945. The announcement came over camp loudspeakers in English first, then repeated by Private Margaret Chen in careful Japanese that stripped away any possibility of misunderstanding. The Emperor himself had spoken on radio. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Unconditional surrender to Allied forces. The divine wind had not come. The sacred islands would be occupied. The unthinkable had become reality. The barracks erupted in chaos that had nothing to do with celebration. Women collapsed where they stood, bodies folding inward like paper in flame. Others became catatonic, staring at walls with eyes that saw nothing, minds retreating to places where emperors didn't surrender, and divine nations didn't lose wars, and everything they'd believed hadn't just shattered into dust. Some screamed, some prayed, some sat in perfect silence that was somehow louder than any sound. Mrs. Yamada, who'd attempted suicide months earlier and had slowly begun eating again, stopped mid-bite with rice halfway to her mouth and simply froze, the bowl slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. Keiko felt the announcement like a physical blow. She'd known Japan was losing. Anyone with eyes could see the trajectory, the way American forces had island-hopped closer to the home islands, the way letters from Japan described increasing desperation and starvation. But knowing intellectually that defeat was coming and hearing the Emperor's voice admit it were different universes. The Emperor never spoke directly to citizens. His voice was sacred, divine, too holy for radio waves and common ears. That he had broken centuries of tradition to announce surrender meant the situation was beyond catastrophic. It meant everything had already ended. They were just now hearing about the funeral. Sachiko gripped Keiko's arm hard enough to bruise. Her nurse's composure completely shattered. She was crying, but not the soft tears Keiko had seen before. These were wrenching, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief. Sachiko whispered questions that had no answers. What happened to the families on Saipan who'd believed the propaganda? What happened to the children, whose parents had killed them rather than face American capture? What happened to all the people who'd chosen death over dishonor based on lies about enemy treatment? What happened to Keiko's brother who'd survived American captivity, only to kill himself from shame 3 days after returning home? They'd all died for nothing, for propaganda, for narratives that hadn't been true. The bacon breakfast had been real all along, and people had chosen death rather than test that reality. Henderson appeared in the barracks doorway, her face grave but not unkind. She'd brought the camp doctor and 3 other medical staff, anticipating crisis. They moved through the room with practiced efficiency, checking pulses, preventing self-harm, administering sedatives to women who'd become danger to themselves. Henderson knelt beside Sachiko and Keiko, not touching them but present, and said in her hybrid Japanese English that they were safe, that surrender meant they'd be going home, that repatriation would begin as soon as transport could be arranged. She meant it as comfort. It landed like a threat, going home. The words sat between them like stones. Home to what? Home to a Japan that had lost everything? Home to families who'd survived firebombing and starvation while their daughters and sisters and wives had gained weight in American camps? Home to a culture that had prepared them to die rather than surrender, and now had to reconcile that the Emperor himself had chosen surrender. Home to questions about what they'd done to survive, what they'd told the Americans, what they'd learned and seen and eaten that had kept them alive while good Japanese patriots had chosen death. The camp became a strange holding facility over the following days. The war was over, but the women were still prisoners, still bound by regulations and barbed wire and the liminal space between nations. Red Cross officials arrived with clipboards and transport schedules. Repatriation ships were being organized. Japanese civilians held in American camps would be returned to Japan as soon as logistics allowed. The phrase, "as soon as logistics allowed," stretched like taffy, weeks, maybe months. They were going home to a country that no longer existed in the form they'd left it, to an emperor who was no longer divine, to a people who'd been told they could never lose, and now had to live with losing. Keiko made a decision that felt like the only honest thing left. She approached Henderson during medical rounds and asked for something more dangerous than documentation. She asked for copies of her complete camp records, medical files, work assignments, testimony transcripts, everything. The most comprehensive evidence possible. She told Henderson it was for her family, but both women understood the real purpose. Insurance, proof. A weapon against whatever accusations might come. If she was going to face interrogation about collaboration, she wanted evidence that she'd done nothing shameful. That she'd simply survived according to rules the Americans themselves had written. Henderson looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them that went beyond language or nationality. A recognition, a shared understanding that they were both trapped in systems larger than themselves, that rules could protect and rules could condemn, that the bacon breakfast had created evidence that was simultaneously salvation and damnation. Henderson said she'd see what she could do, which wasn't yes, but wasn't no, which was as much as regulations and conscience would allow. 2 days later, Henderson slipped Keiko a package during routine distribution. Not hidden this time. Official. A Red Cross care package marked for repatriation, the kind being issued to all prisoners for the journey home. Inside were the regulation items, toiletries, basic clothing, a small amount of currency for immediate needs, but also, folded carefully in tissue paper, a complete set of medical records. Tuberculosis treatment logs with Sachiko's name, caloric intake documentation, work assignment records showing voluntary labor and wages paid. A written statement from Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard on official letterhead, confirming that prisoner Keiko Tanaka had been detained according to Geneva Convention standards and had conducted herself with dignity throughout her internment. And a letter, handwritten in careful Japanese, from Henderson herself. The letter was brief. It said that regulations didn't permit her to give these documents, but conscience didn't permit her to withhold them. That Keiko and the other women had done nothing shameful, had simply survived a war they didn't start, had been caught in the machinery of conflict and had emerged with their humanity intact. That the bacon breakfast had been real, and the treatment had followed rules, and none of that was betrayal no matter what anyone claimed. That Henderson hoped these papers would help, though she suspected they might hurt instead. That sometimes evidence was a burden, but that truth mattered even when truth was dangerous, especially when truth was dangerous. Keiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it into her hidden journal alongside the photograph and her brother's death notification, and all the other pieces of a story she was beginning to understand she'd have to carry alone. The documentation felt heavy in her hands, heavier than paper should feel, heavy with responsibility and testimony, and the knowledge that she was bringing contraband truth back to a nation that had built itself on lies. Other women received similar packages. Henderson had violated regulations for all of them, had risked her career to provide proof that would probably create more problems than it solved. The women gathered in the barracks that night, not to celebrate but to bear witness, to acknowledge what they were about to do. They were going home carrying evidence. Evidence that Americans had treated them like human beings. Evidence that Geneva Convention compliance was possible. Evidence that propaganda had lied on both sides. Evidence that their survival hadn't required collaboration or spiritual surrender. Just the application of international law by people who chose to follow it, even when hate screamed louder than reason. They were going home as living testimony, as walking proof, as bacon-fed, tuberculosis-treated, weight-gained evidence that everything Japan had taught them about American demons was false. And that evidence, they all understood, might get them killed more efficiently than any battlefield ever could. Truth was the most dangerous weapon. They were loading it into their luggage alongside soap and tissue paper, and the last remnants of a war that had ended in surrender, but would continue in silence and shame, and the careful editing of history to protect narratives that couldn't survive contact with reality. Keiko touched the package one more time, feeling the weight of paper and proof. Then she packed it carefully, at the bottom of her assigned duffel, beneath clothing and toiletries and all the harmless things prisoners took home. Hidden, but present. Silent, but screaming. The bacon breakfast was coming to Japan, and Japan, she suspected, was not prepared for what that breakfast represented. The end of a war was just the beginning of a longer battle. The battle for truth. And Keiko had just enlisted. The repatriation ship departed San Francisco in early October 1945, a converted transport vessel filled with Japanese civilians being returned to a homeland that no longer resembled the nation they'd left. Keiko stood on deck as America receded into morning fog, watching the Golden Gate Bridge disappear like a dream dissolving on waking. The women were given private quarters, separated from male prisoners, treated with the same bureaucratic courtesy that had defined their entire captivity. Meals appeared on schedule. Medical staff checked on the sick. Everything documented. Everything regulated. Everything according to rules that would cease to apply the moment they touched Japanese soil. The Pacific crossing took 3 weeks, each day carrying them closer to an uncertain future. The women gathered in small groups, speaking in whispers about what awaited them. Some had received letters confirming that family members had survived the firebombing. Others had received nothing and were sailing toward potential emptiness, toward homes that might be ash, toward relatives who might be dead. They shared rumors about the occupation, about American forces landing on sacred islands, about the emperor remaining alive but stripped of divinity, about food shortages so severe that people were eating grass and bark and anything that might sustain life for one more day. Keiko spent hours on deck, watching the ocean and thinking about her brother. He'd made this same crossing in reverse, captured on Guadalcanal, and transported to an American camp she'd never been able to identify. He'd survived the camp, had probably received bacon for breakfast, medical care, wages for voluntary work, all the Geneva Convention compliance that the system provided, had probably gained weight and learned basic English and started to question the propaganda that had sent him to war. And then he'd been released in a prisoner exchange, had made this crossing back to Japan, had stepped onto home soil, and lasted exactly 3 days before shame killed him more efficiently than any American weapon ever could. She wondered if he'd tried to tell anyone about the treatment he'd received, wondered if he'd mentioned the bacon, wondered if that mention had been what sealed his fate, if admitting that Americans had fed him and healed him and treated him like a human being had been the final proof that he'd been spiritually compromised. The documentation hidden in her luggage felt like her brother's ghost, like evidence that might have saved him if he'd had it, like proof that could destroy her for the same reasons it might have destroyed him. Sachiko found her on deck one evening as sunset painted the ocean red and gold. She stood beside Keiko in comfortable silence, 2 women who'd survived something that defied easy explanation. Sachiko's tuberculosis was in remission, her lungs clear, her body healthy in ways that would have been impossible without American medicine and American bacon, and American willingness to treat enemy prisoners like human beings deserving of care. She carried her own documentation, her own proof, her own dangerous truth. They talked about what they would say when questioned. Because they would be questioned, that much was certain. Returned prisoners always faced interrogation, examination, assessment of loyalty and behavior during captivity. The standard questions would come. Were you tortured? Were you starved? Were you forced to provide intelligence? Were you coerced into propaganda statements? The expected answers were yes, yes, no, no. The true answers were no, no, yes, but voluntarily, yes, but honestly. The true answers were poison. Sachiko asked what Keiko planned to do with the documentation, whether she'd show it to authorities or hide it, whether she'd testify to the treatment or lie. Keiko didn't have an answer. She only knew that destroying the evidence felt like erasing her brother's death, like admitting that truth didn't matter as much as narrative control, like surrendering to the same propaganda that had killed so many. But keeping the evidence felt like choosing a different kind of death. Slower, lonelier. The social death of being labeled a collaborator, a traitor, a woman too weak to die when dying would have been honorable. The ship crossed the international dateline, and suddenly, it was a day later, time itself bending around their journey home. Some women took it as an omen. Others laughed bitterly at the absurdity of losing a day just as they were about to lose everything else. Keiko thought about time differently, about how the 3 weeks in the barracks at Camp McCoy had been both the longest and shortest period of her life, about how the bacon breakfast had lasted maybe 15 minutes, but its consequences would echo for decades, about how her brother's 3 days between return and suicide had been enough time to destroy him, but not enough time to save him. The coast of Japan appeared on a gray morning, mountains rising from mist like memories taking solid form. Women crowded the rails, some crying, some silent, all facing the enormity of return. This was the moment they'd theoretically been waiting for since capture, repatriation, reunion, homecoming. But the word home felt hollow. They weren't going home. They were going to the ruins of home, to the ghost of home, to a place that wore home's name, but had become something else entirely in their absence. The ship docked at Uraga, south of Tokyo Bay. American military personnel oversaw the disembarkation with the same careful documentation that had defined everything about their captivity. Names checked against manifests. Medical clearances reviewed. Each woman issued papers confirming her identity and status as repatriated civilian prisoner. The papers were in English and Japanese, official and thorough, and completely inadequate to capture what they represented. These women had been fed bacon by their enemies, had been treated according to international law, had survived. And survival, in the Japan they were returning to, was its own accusation. Japanese officials waited on the dock, men in ill-fitting civilian clothes that had probably been military uniforms weeks earlier. They carried clipboards and wore expressions that managed to be both blank and accusatory. The women filed down the gangplank in silence, each step taking them from American jurisdiction to Japanese authority, from the protection of Geneva Convention compliance to the judgment of a nation that had prepared them to die rather than surrender. Keiko's feet touched Japanese soil for the first time in nearly 2 years. The ground felt wrong somehow, or maybe she'd changed so much that home felt foreign. Her father was supposed to meet her. The Red Cross had forwarded notification of her return, but she didn't see him in the crowd of waiting families. Just officials, just questioners, just the machinery of a defeated nation trying to reassert control over the uncontrollable fact that some prisoners had survived. They were loaded onto trucks, processed through a temporary facility, given basic information about food distribution and housing assignments and curfews under occupation. Everything was shortages and regulations and the gray exhaustion of a people who'd lost everything, including the narratives that had made loss bearable. Keiko was issued temporary papers and told her father had been notified of her location. She could expect him within a few days. In the meantime, she'd stay in a communal facility for returned civilians, a converted school building that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. That first night, sleeping on a mat in a room with 20 other returned prisoners, Keiko opened her luggage and touched the hidden documentation. Papers that proved she'd been treated according to rules. Papers that proved the propaganda had lied. Papers that proved her brother might have survived if shame hadn't killed him. Papers that might destroy her the same way they might have destroyed him. She didn't take them out, didn't look at them, just touched them through the fabric of her duffel, and thought about bacon and testimony, and the crushing weight of truth in a nation that had built itself on lies. Outside, Tokyo was dark under occupation blackout rules, silent except for the occasional patrol, empty of the sounds she remembered, temple bells and street vendors and children playing. The war had ended 4 months ago, but this didn't feel like peace. It felt like the pause between falling and hitting the ground, like the held breath before screaming, like the moment between realizing propaganda was false and deciding what to do with that realization. Sachiko lay on the mat beside her, not sleeping, just breathing. 2 women who'd eaten bacon together and gained weight together and learned that enemies could follow rules. 2 women carrying proof that survival hadn't required spiritual surrender. 2 women about to discover what that proof would cost in a nation that needed surrender to be shameful. Because if surrender could be honorable, then everything that came before surrender was meaningless. The bacon breakfast was home, and home, Keiko was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous place of all.